No man has grown more popular among the information-starved denizens of the internet than Professor Jiang Shui-Chin, host of Predictive History. Now, he has received a lot of criticism recently because he's not actually a professor and he doesn't have any degrees in the subjects he talks about.
But I never said I was a professor. It's the internet who called me professor.
Hold on. You don't call yourself Professor Jiang on your YouTube channel.
I do now.
But you know what? I don't care about that. What I care about is the fact he's just plain wrong. In case you don't know who he is, he spams out endless lectures where he vomits up factoids and conspiracy theories that, besides being baseless, also contradict each other. This Assassin's Creed slop is the foundation of predictions about the future more insane than those of What If Altist, and that guy thinks Odin talks to him. So far, in over 100 videos, Professor Jeang has only made 2 correct predictions, the same predictions that I and countless others also made. I honestly believe that Professor Jeang might be a CIA op to make random high school students in China dumber, but he escaped containment and is now making millions of gullible Americans dumber. And listen, if you're a fan of his, I know that your high school history teacher was boring. I know that Zhang's ideas itch some sort of scratch in people's amygdala. His ideas that, pyramids were probably a way for ancient Egyptians to store energy, that the world is controlled by secret religious cults who have an evil scheme of world domination, or that all of Roman history was fabricated, or that America's definitely about to collapse any moment now and we're going to have a new world order. I know that these scratch some itch. But they're just wrong. Professor Jiang is fundamentally wrong.
He's a complete buffoon, right?
This is What, Why, How, and that's what the video's about. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support the channel on patreon.com/whatwhyhow. Okay, so Professor Jiang's entire credibility is based on making 2 predictions that turn out to be correct. 1, Donald Trump would win the 2024 presidential election, and then 2, he would attack Iran. Now, I don't want to toot my own horn. I don't like when people do that. But guess what? I and plenty of other people predicted the same exact thing, that Trump would win the 2024 election and launch a war with Iran. And President Trump mulls his options. With a nuclear scare growing, Trump opts to strike another round of Iranian targets, this time domestic. I also predicted Trump would launch a major domestic program to round up immigrants, triggering major protests. So for all the predictive history fans out there, based on your own standards, you have to trust me just as much as you trust Professor Jiang, just right off the bat. But you know what? These are obvious and easy predictions to make. Trump killed Qasem Soleimani and almost bombed Iran's domestic territory in his first term. And it was obvious for anyone watching that Biden, then Kamala Harris, wouldn't perform very well in the election, considering the economy wasn't performing very well.
America is a nation that can be defined in a single word. I was going to
But again, I don't think I deserve special credit for this. I don't think anyone does, because these are such obvious predictions to make. Like predicting it'll rain after a few days of summer heat. Yeah, no shit. What about actually challenging things? What additional benefit does Jiang provide? Well, on April 2nd, Jiang said that Trump would purposefully lose the war with Iran. This is what he says.
Okay, but let's put our thinking caps on. Okay, let's use game theory and say, but what if, for some strange reason, Donald Trump wants to lose his war in Iran? What if he wants the American empire to collapse? What if Donald Trump wants to destroy the global economy? And then he'd be a genius, right? Right? He's a moron because he's going to destroy the American empire, but if he actually wants to destroy the American empire, then the man is the greatest American president ever, okay? Okay, so we're gonna have a fun class today, and we're gonna make the argument that in fact, Donald Trump is a genius. That in fact, all this chaos is purposeful. That there's actually a plan behind all this, okay? That's the argument I want to make to you today. Okay, so what is the plan?
This is the dumbest thing that has possibly ever been said. No, the United States is not purposefully losing the war. The Trump administration is dumb. The Trump administration thought they could win. They were wrong. Obviously, it doesn't seem like we're doing very well, but they're not purposefully losing. He goes on to explain that one reason for this is that the United States wants to disrupt the Iranian oil industry so people rely more on the United States for oil. And that could be true, but that's not purposefully losing a war. That's not what losing means. So that's one reason he provides. The next reason he provides is at the end of the video.
Okay? All right? So again, I understand Trump is an idiot. Trump has launched America into this stupid war in the Middle East. Trump has pissed off NATO. Trump has pissed off all of America's allies. So he's a retard. But if the goal was to destroy the American empire, destroy the global economy, and rebuild America for the benefit of Americans, then Trump is a genius. And he may go down in history as America's greatest president. Okay? All right. Any questions?
This is again tremendously stupid. America invading Iran to destroy Iranian oil production is one thing. That at least has some basis in some conceivable rational self-interest. But now he's changed back to his original claim that the war against Iran is purposefully designed to destroy NATO, to alienate the entire world from America, and to retreat from the empire, i.e. hurt America. But Trump could have just done all those things. He didn't have to attack Iran to do that. I mean, first, you have to have the belief that Trump wants to be isolationist, and he wants to dismantle the American empire, which those things are not true. They were never true. The closest you can get to that is how Trump is critical of NATO, but he's critical of NATO because he thinks they're freeloaders. He doesn't think America should be completely isolationist, and he never has. So first you have to have that belief. Then you have to have the fantastical idea that instead of just leaving NATO or something, Trump has to do this Rube Goldberg machine scheme for no reason to do so. It doesn't make any sense. Later on he says this about the Russia-Ukraine war.
Wait, but Donald Trump's an idiot. Where would he get this idea from? How would he know how to do this? And the answer is because Putin has already proven that this strategy works in Ukraine. Okay, so let me show you how. Okay, so this is the war in Ukraine. And as you can see, the dark red are areas in which Russia is contesting territory. The light red, the pink are areas in which Russia wants to gain territory. As you can see, Russia still has a long way to go. And we're already 4 or 5 years into this war, which means that this war can go on for another 10, 20 years. It's a very slow grind. And it's good for Russia. Yes, I know that Russia is losing a lot of soldiers, and I know that the Russian economy is suffering, but this long war of attrition is good for Russia. Why? Well, because first of all, what it does is it allows Russia to industrialize its economy. Okay? It allows Russia to center its economy around war production. Okay?
Okay, so Vladimir Putin is not an absolute dictator, but he does have lots of power and support in Russia. If he wanted to militarize the Russian economy, he could have just done that. He could have passed a bill saying we're going to provide this amount of GDP towards military production. He could have done that. And he could have done that without losing thousands upon thousands of people in the trenches of Ukraine. There's no actual reason why he had to invade Ukraine to do that. This is like saying, yeah, you know what, I purposefully lost all those millions of dollars gambling because now I get to work 2 jobs and I get to improve my skills at those jobs. You could have just gotten 2 jobs. You didn't need to lose millions of dollars gambling, right? Anyways, Jiang starts making a bunch of conjecture about Russia's plan to dominate Eurasia. And you know what? Russia does plan to expand its power in Europe and Asia, so that's not too crazy. But then he says America is envious of Russia's specific plan.
So, given this, America's like, well, we can do the same thing, okay? And so the grand plan for America is something called the Technate, okay? Sorry. This is something we'll discuss more later on, okay? But first I want to introduce this idea to you, the Technate. And the Technate is very simple. It's the idea that, you know what? Yes, the world is going into chaos. The world is collapsing. But North America is self-sufficient. right? So these past few months, Donald Trump has been picking a fight with Denmark over Greenland, right? He's been threatening Canada. He's been threatening Mexico. He's been threatening Colombia. He's thinking over Venezuela. He's been threatening Cuba. He's been threatening Honduras, Nicaragua.
Now, it's pretty obvious the Trump administration is fantasizing about controlling more territory in North America. That's what the thing about Canada and Greenland, the stuff he lists, that's what it's all about. But why is that contradictory with a global empire? Professor Jiang somehow doesn't realize you can both control Greenland and have military bases in the Middle East. Those are not contradictory. President McKinley invaded Cuba and the Philippines. Trump obviously wants to maximize the power of America across the globe, whether in Canada or the Persian Gulf, which is what a rational, realist interpretation of international relations predicts he'd want to do. Now, of course, he's doing bizarre things that are outside the normal suite of American behavior, but the root motivation is the same. It's the same root motivation why George W. Bush invaded Iraq, why Obama bombed Libya, why we intervened in World War II. It's because we want to maximize our power. That's what any country wants to do. But Jiang's predictions are literally the opposite, that Trump wants to reduce American power across the globe by destroying all of its alliances for some strange harebrained scheme that has no rational basis. It's literally clinically insane. But also Jiang is clueless about this thing. You know where that map comes from? It comes from a random radical political group in the 1930s called Technocracy Incorporated. The technocrats, I have a video about them, they wanted a dictatorship of engineers. That's where the word Technate comes from. They, like a million other groups or people in America, wanted to invade and occupy Canada, Mexico, and other parts of North America, just like Alexander Hamilton or James K. Polk. But just because Trump wants to do the same doesn't mean he wants to build a Technate. That's a very specific term that Jiang, in his cluelessness, is applying to a completely different scenario. Now, Jiang has been predicting that Trump would probably win and probably attack Iran since his second video back in 2024. But let's look at the video where he explains his reasoning in more detail. Geostrategy number 5, why Trump will win, and pick Nikki Haley as his VP. Right off the bat, you can see he got something very obviously wrong. Trump didn't pick Nikki Haley VP, and by May 2024, the time of this video, he obviously wasn't going to pick Nikki Haley to be vice president. Remarkably, Jiang hasn't noticed that Trump doesn't hire people who insult him and compete against him for power. Now, Vice President J.D. Vance did insult Trump, but he apologized and he probably begged for forgiveness at Trump's feet. Now, you might say, who cares? It's just a vice presidential prediction. But here's the thing, though. Jiang's entire prediction on why Donald Trump will invade Iran relies on him mysteriously picking Nikki Haley to be his vice president. Let's talk about why he thinks that's the case.
It's all theater, okay? Politics is theater. What Nikki Haley and Donald Trump are doing is pretending to be bitter enemies so that their reconciliation will be so dramatic. You understand?
This is just not true. Trump doesn't pretend to be bitter enemies with anybody. He either hates you or he loves you, and you'll know which one it is. There's no in-between. But the reason all of this is important is because
all this is telling us is that if Nikki Haley becomes vice president, her main responsibility will be to agitate for war against Iran. Okay? She'll be the one in the White House pushing for war in Iran, escalating tensions in Iran.
Now that right there is the whole basis of why he predicted the United States would attack Iran. Because Nikki Haley, as vice president, would somehow push the government to attack Iran, even though as vice president, she would have zero actual power to do anything like that. That's his basis. Here's a further example of how Jiang completely misunderstands how American politics works. In this video, he says,
so a lot of what he will do as president depends on if he picks Nikki Haley to be VP or not. We'll know in August if he wants Nikki Haley to be his VP, okay? But if he picks Nikki Haley as VP, that's a sure sign that he's going to go to war with Iran, I think, okay? Because she'll be pushing for war with Iran, okay? But then the question is, how will Donald Trump's base react? Okay, because his base is actually extremely anti-Nikki Haley and anti-war, right? And the answer is, at first, what will happen is that the elite, the mainstream media, will support Trump in his war with Iran. Okay, and you have a lot of people who supported Trump who felt betrayed. Okay, but then over time, what will happen is that Donald Trump will figure out how to manipulate his base so that his base comes back to him. Do you understand? Okay, and so there are different ways he can do that. First of all, what he can do is blame Nikki Haley in the deep state and says, "Oh, I was fooled. I was manipulated. I now want out of this war." Okay. After he wins in 2028, he can change directions and say, I now want to end this war and make America into a Christian isolationist theocracy, okay? Okay, do you understand? That's something that he can do, all right?
Now, wait a second. He just said a dozen things that make zero sense. First, the Trump base isn't anti-war. Most Trump supporters support this war. The Trump base in its essence is just pro-Trump. First and foremost, everything else is secondary. Anything Trump would do, they would support. Anything he doesn't do, they oppose. Second, Trump would never say he was manipulated or deceived by someone else because that would be embarrassing. Saying he would admit defeat is to fundamentally misunderstand who Trump is. If Trump invaded Iran and it went poorly, he would just say it was a gargantuan success anyways, and his base would believe him. He would never say someone manipulated him. Oh, also, the elite and the mainstream media as a whole would never support a Trump invasion of Iran, which Jiang remarkably claims they would. Now, Fox News would, but all the others wouldn't, and they haven't. Fourth, Trump is not even a Christian himself. So why would he make America into a Christian isolationist theocracy? Even if he wanted to do that, which he doesn't, he can't. He also can't run for a third term in 2028. Let's rewind a little bit to see how Professor Jiang explains that.
The only thing that he actually cares about is, how do I stay in office for the rest of my life? Okay? Now, there's a trick he can use to stay in office for the rest of his life, okay? Because the Constitution says that you can only serve 2 terms as president. But there's nothing in the Constitution that says you can't serve as vice president for as long as you want. Do you understand? So what Trump can do in 2028 is have his son run for president and he becomes the vice president. But everyone will know that he'll still be the president. You understand? Does that make sense to you guys?
This is Reddit tier analysis. This kind of crap is what made the last season of House of Cards so terrible. It is again also based on this bizarre assumption that the vice presidency carries some inherent power in the American political system that just isn't there. Why would Trump ever bother being vice president? Why wouldn't he just retire from office and advise from behind the scenes at Mar-a-Lago? He doesn't need to be the literal vice president to influence whatever heir he wants to hold the crown after him. He can just call the president and tell him what to do as a private citizen, kind of like Trump's donors do to him. The idea, I suppose, is that he needs to literally be in Washington, D.C. to still be president, but here's the thing. Donald Trump doesn't actually want to be president. Donald Trump wants the glory that comes from the presidency. He wants his face on the dollar bill and on the side of buildings and on Mount Rushmore. He wants the country to worship him. And obviously he also wants the immunity that comes with the office as well, so he can get away with enriching himself in the meantime. But here's the thing. He can just get a pardon, or even pardon himself, and then he's immune for all the crimes he did in office. And there's nothing anybody can do. He has literally talked about pardoning himself before. Now that would apply to federal charges, of course. He can't pardon himself for state charges. But here's the thing, Jiang is not predicting that Trump would run for the presidency again, but for the vice presidency. The vice president does not have immunity from state charges. The 12th Amendment is pretty clear. No person constitutionally ineligible to the office of president shall be eligible to that of vice president of the United States. Trump has been elected president twice before. He is not eligible to be vice president in the 2028 presidential election. This is very cut and dry. There's just no way around it. There's no rule bending here. There's no alternative interpretation. If the entire Supreme Court was made up of Trump sycophants, that would be one thing. But even Trump's conservative judges rule against him on the cut and dry cases. They're conservative judges. They're not Trump-worshipping judges. So not only is it pointless and politically senseless for Trump to run as VP in 2028, it is also impossible. Again, all of this is the fantasy of some random high school teacher who has very little understanding, obviously, of American politics. If you disagree with me, again, I predicted the same exact things that Professor Jiang did. If you trust him for doing that, you have to trust me as well. Okay? Alright? Does that make sense? Let's look a little deeper. I am an American. I'm one of nearly 800,000 people who watched this video, and a good portion of those people, not I, but a good portion of them, believed this video. So why exactly is our country going to have a civil war? Well, as Jeang explains, America is an inherently violent country. We have a lot of guns and we play tackle football after all, and also we fight a lot of wars. And also, 1776 wasn't justified for some reason. Here's what he says.
The reality is that Americans believed this war was sacred, and it was a revolution in human affairs. But if you actually look at the history of this war, you'll discover that the Americans didn't really fight this war for a good reason. They fought this war because the British were taxing them. But if you think about it, well, the British were providing defense. They were providing the army, right? So the British had a very good reason to tax the Americans. But the Americans didn't really like this, so they rebelled, okay? And the rebellion was actually the first American Civil War because there were actually a lot of Americans who wanted to remain in the Union. And so these loyalists, a lot of them were terrorized by extremists who wanted independence.
Now, it is true that loyalists faced intimidation and sometimes violence. It is true that Britain provided some soldiers to fight in the French and Indian War. But guess what? That doesn't matter. It's not relevant. Americans deserved an equal say in their fate as their cousins who lived across the ocean. This is simply a moral principle that Jiang doesn't understand. Government is a servant of the people, and we the people have the right to tell the government what to do. So the American Revolution had very good reasons. Then he explains the wars against Native Americans and the American Civil War. He says the issue of slavery drove tensions to a boiling point. That's true. Then he says,
the turning point was in 1860 when Abraham Lincoln was elected President of the United States. And Lincoln was radically anti-slavery. He believed that slavery was evil and had to be abolished at some point. Okay? The rest of the world abolished slavery. Why is it in America there are so many slaves? So that was Lincoln's agenda. But Lincoln was also a lawyer, and he believed that the South legally had a right to slavery. But over time, what we can do is limit slavery in the West. And therefore, over time, in maybe 100 years' time, slavery would naturally cease to exist. Okay? That was Lincoln's plan. Now, the South did not like this plan, and they were afraid of what Lincoln might really do as president, so they declared independence from the United States. They basically seceded from the Union, okay? And Lincoln, in response, invaded the South, okay? So basically, the Civil War was a battle over how much power the federal government had, okay? So from the perspective of the South, they were fighting the war for their right to freely express their political views, okay? And the North was fighting to maintain the Union. Slavery was not the main issue. In fact, Lincoln himself said that if if I could end the war without freeing these slaves, I would do so. Slavery is not the main issue.
This is such a mid-wit conclusion. He literally spent a dozen sentences, many minutes, explaining why slavery was the cause of the Civil War, even to the point of saying the South seceded because it was scared Lincoln would abolish slavery, which is true. I have a whole video about that, by the way. And then he says, actually, they just wanted to freely express their political views. What? I don't even know what that means. Jiang, you dribbled through the entire opposing team. You're an inch from the goal line. Why did you kick the ball out of bounds? You literally changed your mind at the last second to randomly choose the dumber answer. Now he is right that Lincoln prioritized restoring the Union over abolishing slavery at first. But as I talked about in my last video on the Civil War, the North didn't cause the Civil War, the South did, by seceding. And they seceded because they were scared Lincoln would attack slavery. This is what Jiang just said. So therefore, pretty obviously, the Civil War was about slavery. Also, restricting slavery was still a motivation of Lincoln during the Civil War, which is why he supported, all those amendments that abolished slavery. Maybe you've heard of them? Anyways, Jiang next talks about the fundamental divides that were part of America since the beginning, as if there have been some sort of constant feud in American civilization, which there hasn't. It changes a lot over time. Anyways, he says this about the Founding Fathers.
But there's also another strand of America, and these are dissidents or political dissidents. And they believe in the Enlightenment. They believe that reason should be the god of human affairs. Okay? And these were the Founding Fathers. Okay? The Founding Fathers believed in something called deism, which is that there is a God, but God gave us the power, reason, and logic to determine our own affairs. So the Constitution is a document based on deism, okay? Separation of church and state. And they want to create a multicultural, secular empire, okay? And today it manifests itself.
Now, he is right that most Founding Fathers wanted a secular, irreligious government, hence the First Amendment. But basically all of them were actually Christians. They just believed religious issues should be decided by the people on their own without government interference, which after all had a long history of causing civil wars in England. Even then, some wanted a formal recognition of Christianity. Really the only true deist among the Founding Fathers was Thomas Jefferson, who liked Jesus and Christianity, but didn't believe in all the miracles and all the magic and that sort of stuff. So religious freedom in the United States is not a product of deism, but instead the Christian Enlightenment. But here's the thing. Professor Jiang says the Founding Fathers were secular hippie deists here in this video. Then he says this in a different video.
First is that there are many Christians who believe that Israel and the Jews must be used as a tool to bring Jesus back, okay? That's the first thing. Second thing is that America was founded as a Christian nation. Therefore, its soul is Christian. Its first leaders were Christians who believed in Christian Zionism. Their descendants now control the military and the foreign policy apparatus of America. Okay, that's the second thing, okay?
This is just a blatant contradiction between the two videos, and it's because Professor Jiang doesn't actually believe in anything. He just kind of makes it up as he goes along, based on skimming Wikipedia, or maybe ChatGPT. Maybe he uses ChatGPT to come up with this crap. And this is a pretty important contradiction because it presents two absolutely contradictory visions of what America's founders wanted the nation to be, which is, of course, the defining factor of the videos, right? In one video, he says America is a secular nation that the Christians want to take over. In the other video, he says it's a Christian Zionist nation, which is why it supports Israel. Those are opposite things. And it just depends on what argument he wants to make in any given day. Here's the truth. The Founding Fathers weren't Christian Zionists. The closest you get to that is John Adams writing a letter in 1819, long after he was president, saying he wishes Jewish people had their own country in Judea so they would abandon their religion and become liberal, Unitarian Christians. So we got one Founding Father saying something Christian Zionist near the end of his life. That's it. Then we also have one founding father being a deist, and the rest were just Christians. So Jiang gets it wrong in both directions. But let's go back to his Civil War video. He starts listing all the different factions in America that can fight in a civil war.
Then you have federal agencies like the FBI and the CIA and Homeland Security, okay? NSA, okay? There's dozens of these federal agencies. They themselves are their own army, meaning that the FBI and the CIA all have their special forces, tanks, helicopters, jets, bombs, missiles, okay?
You know what? Jiang is absolutely correct here. I'm wrong. The FBI and NSA definitely have fighter jets. I know it's true because he just randomly thought that up and wrote it on a whiteboard, so it has to be true. Let's do a speed round though. Jiang predicted that the 2024 presidential election will see one of the lowest turnouts in history, which it didn't. It was right between 2016 and 2020 in turnout. He says the right is very isolationist and the left is very interventionist, which is just not true when you look at the data outside of podcast bros who accidentally stumbled into supporting Trump in 2024. Anyways, there's infinite Professor Jiang slop to review. Here's another thing that Professor Jiang evidently has no clue about: the Holocaust. In Civilization number 54, The German Will to Power, Jiang starts reading a Hitler speech.
Today I will once more be a prophet. The international Jewish financiers in and outside Europe should succeed in plunging the nations once more into a world war, then the result will not be the Bolshevization of the earth and thus the victory of Jewry, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe, okay? So we don't actually have any concrete evidence for the Holocaust.
Professor Jiang, it's right behind you. You literally just read it. Next he says,
okay, so one piece of evidence for the Holocaust is this speech by Hitler. But I want to explain what he is saying here, okay? What he's saying is, we, the German nation, want to be left alone. We want to be united. We want to be unified. But the capitalists and the communists all seek to undermine us. And who are the communists? And who are the capitalists? The Jews. Okay? It's the Jews who are a metaphor for a national elite group of individuals who are conspiring to undermine the vitality and the strength of the German nation. All right? So that's what he's saying here. All right.
So they just want to be left alone, he says. And what happens exactly if they're not left alone, Professor Jiang? What happens? Was there any threat in that? Maybe anything about annihilation? You just said it. Maybe you could try to think back a couple seconds to see. Anyways, Professor Jiang was asked about this on a podcast. Professor Jiang on his painful personal path.
I wanted to show the anatomy of hatred. What drove the Germans to hate the Jews this much? And I wanted to analyze Hitler's speeches and the bureaucratic memos in order to gain insight into the psychology of these Nazis, because that's my background. I'm an English literature major, and I specialize in close reading. We call it close reading at Yale. So we basically read text and look at diction and syntax in order to figure out the psychology of the writer. And so when I was teaching Germany, like Prussia, I spent a lot of time looking for his speeches, going through his speeches, which was not that many. And I tried to do a lot of research on the internet, and I couldn't find anything. I mean, so that's what confused me. It was cognitive dissonance, where if it is a systematic extermination ordered by Hitler, you would think there'd be a speech justifying or explaining why he's doing what he's doing in order to rally the German people to his cause. Or at the very least, there would be a blueprint, a bureaucratic blueprint for how you would actually implement this. Because, I mean, it's logistics, right? You need to bring in the gas from somewhere. You need to pay for it. You need to, right? I mean, it has to be like a military operation. And I couldn't find any documentation. I couldn't find any real direct evidence. And that's why in my lecture, I said, listen, I'm not saying the Holocaust didn't happen. It must have happened. But there's no direct evidence for it that I could find, which I found really frustrating. Okay, so that's a background to what happened.
Yeah.
Even if you ignore literally entire libraries of evidence, direct concrete evidence, even if you ignore all the testimony, all the photographs, even if you ignore the fact that Europe was mysteriously missing 6 million Jews and millions of other people after World War II, even if you ignore Himmler himself directly saying they were launching a genocide of Jews in an audio recording, which I'll play right now.
Ich meine die Judenevakuierung, die Ausrottung des jüdischen Volkes. Es gehört zu den Dingen, die man leicht ausspricht. Das jüdische Volk wird ausgerottet. Das sagt Ihnen jede Parteigenosse. Ganz klar, steht in unserem Programm drin. Ausschaltung der Juden, Ausrottung machen wir, Kleinigkeit. Den ich am Anfang gab. Wer sich auch nur eine Mark davon nimmt, ist des Todes. Die Anzahl SS-Männer haben sich dagegen verfehlt. Es sind nicht sehr viele. Und sie werden des Todes sein. Gnadenlos! Wir haben das moralische Recht. Wir hatten die Pflicht, unserem Volk gegenüber das zu tun. Dieses Volk, das uns umbringen wollte, umzubringen. Wir haben aber nicht das Recht, uns auch nur mit einem Pelz, mit einer Mark, mit einer Zigarette, mit einer Uhr, mit sonst etwas zu bereichern. Das haben wir nicht. Denn wir wollen nicht am Schluss, weil wir den Bacillus ausrotten, an dem Bacillus krank werden und sterben. Da werde ich.
Even if you ignore all of that, Professor Jiang, just turn around. You read Hitler explaining why. You just read it. That is a direct explanation, and for some reason he purposefully misreads it to misinterpret it. If you want to learn more about World War II and all of this, you can check out my Zoomer Historian video, by the way, which uses actual sources. I try my best to have, as much as possible, images of the documents, recordings, videos. Now, it takes a little bit of effort to actually, search for stuff. But when you're talking about something so historically significant, like the Holocaust, or like whether or not we're about to have a civil war in America, you need to do better than just scrawling your random thoughts on a whiteboard. But obviously, as is inevitable with slop, it verges onto conspiracy crap. Jiang has a bunch of videos about conspiracy theories. There's just too much for this video though. So if this video gets a lot of views, and if people comment, I'll make a sequel. So like, subscribe, share to your uncle, and check out patreon.com/whatwhyhow to get early access to future videos. Thanks to those who already do, and adios. Does that make sense? Okay? Alright?